I mean, on behalf of the Director General Attorney Paola Nicastro, we weren't here this morning. We had a board meeting that was, you know, supposed to last for half an hour, and it lasted for more than 3 hours. So that's why I'm introducing the institute now. I think that Dario has already talked about the conference. It's a very important conference, I think, both in substantive terms per se and for the institute, which is what I would like to tell you about in the next five-ish minutes. Actually, I mean, the impact of technological change and the socioeconomic impact of technological change has informed the new course of the Institute of Applied Policy Relevant Research Institute since, let's say, mid-2017, providing, at least prospectively, a unified framework to our research. For those of you who don't know, INAPP is one of Italy's 20-ish public research institutes. Interests of public research institutes span across all provinces of knowledge, as it were, and research from public health to astronomy to German studies. Actually, I mean, the National Statistical Bureau of Italy is a public research institute. They are generally overseen by the Ministry of Research and Education, but some are not. The National Statistical Bureau is overseen by the Prime Minister's Office. The National Health Institute is overseen by the Health Ministry. And INAPP is overseen by the Labour Ministry, because it is the only public research institute which is entrusted with the task. We'll be talking a lot about tasks in these 2 days, and you started this morning with the task of carrying out research on socioeconomic policies, and in particular those that interact with or have an impact on the labour market. Thus, we study labor policies, we study social and employment policies, social policies, training policies, and possibly industrial policies that were discussed and debated this in the panel this morning as well. We do that mostly with a focus on Italy, although we have tried in the latest years to, let's say, incentivize more comparative research, framing Italian phenomena and trends in a comparative fashion, also to address what I consider one of the major limitations of Italy's policy making, that is parochialism, which is an issue I'd like to go back to later. I mentioned Italian policymaking because our mission and mandate is to carry out policy-oriented and hopefully policy-relevant research that can provide our stakeholders, and first and foremost, of course, the Labour Ministry and the Prime Minister's Office, but also other branches of government and the regions, with evidence that may form the basis for their policy decisions. And now, of course, technological change and its socioeconomic impact is one of the most prominent areas where we can perform such important, I think, function. As we know, Italian firms may be very dynamic. We had a very nice conference last week on this issue. What they often lack is an overarching framework of reference that may help Italy's productive system to work as a system properly. And what was lacking for several years is what we somewhat loosely call industrial policy, precisely. The plan Industry 4.0 that was introduced 3 years ago by that government, one of the previous governments, provided this framework of reference, but it was just a beginning. And one of its main shortcomings, in my view, is that it only loosely referred to the socioeconomic impact of adopting new technologies. So there were incentives for firms to adopt new technologies, but no, let's say, focus on the socioeconomic impact of adopting new technologies, which is, I guess, a challenge for Italy, but also for other countries and for Europe generally, more in general as well. was also discussed this morning. I mean, these were the issues that we started discussing with the previous governments, also in the context of Italy's presidency of the G7 in 2017, I mean, to which INAPP contributed, providing the background documents for discussion among the G7 labor ministers in Turin. And we do hope we can continue to perform this function and actually scale it up to include precisely the topics of this two-day conference. To do so, I don't know whether Dario introduced the issue, we also develop and manage data sets, and some are particularly relevant for the issues we are discussing today and tomorrow. INAPP, in collaboration with the National Statistical Bureau, runs to our knowledge, the only ONET data infrastructure outside the US. That is, we replicated the ONET for Italy, adapting it to and taking into account the deep structure of the Italian economy. It's called Indagine Campionaria sulle Professioni, 2006, if I'm correct, 2011, and then there will be a new round in 2012. 7 and 12, yeah, it depends upon, you know, the fielding and the publication. So there will be a new round 2019, so 2020. So no crosswalks from US ONET through ISCO for Italy. We actually replicated, I mean, the exercise. So we are able to analyze in a very granular way, as it's fashionable these days to say, Italian occupations and tasks, because we do have elementary data there. And we all know, of course, how important ONET is for discussing topics such as those discussed today and tomorrow in particular. Then we run another data set, which is the audit on company upskilling and reskilling needs, which provides information on precisely such needs as signaled by Italian firms. Such needs, meaning upskilling and reskilling needs. And needless to say, this should be of paramount importance to craft active labor market policies and training policies in the context of task bias technological change, if this could get to the policymaker, of course. While these data and systems, which are in a system called Lavoro e Fabbisogni, look at the beast, as it were, from the viewpoint of individuals. Another set of system of tools that is being developed within the Institute, which is called Atlante Lavoro, focuses on economic sectors, processes, and basic constituents of processes, linking them to qualifications and skills. It also maps the supply of VET in Italy, a precondition, but I mean, of course, I'm embarrassed of speaking, you know, Marius here is one of the most important scholars in this field, a precondition to measure the gap between the current and the prospectively needed supply of skills in the Italian economy. And again, I mean, this could well be used to craft future-oriented, hopefully, public policies in the context of technological change. Other data sets provide invaluable information on firms. We ran a large survey of 30,000 firms in Italy, including the very small ones, which are generally not on the map, but that comprise the most of the Italian economy, actually, and other data sets on quality of work that complement Eurofound data sets. And last but not least, INAPP runs the Italian part of a European social survey that is widely used to assess the social and political impact of structural change. We will be using it this afternoon, for instance, as well as the socio-structural determinants of political behavior. And we are particularly proud for bringing Italy back into the European Social Survey, not just as a funding agency, but actually as its Italian scientific manager, so to speak. So Dario has already gone into the details of the panels of today and tomorrow, so there is no need for restating the importance of these issues for our economies. and actually, I think, democracies. I'm a political scientist and a welfare state guy, so I insisted on having a session on social policy and politics. I think I would have many more things to say regarding also the future directions of the institute. Well, I will allow myself just one more minute to say that what I think the institute should be doing that is related to the needs of Italian policy making. And I will switch to Italian for 1 minute. Io penso che l'istituto dovrebbe continuare e anzi, come dire, andare su di una marcia nello studiare non solo analiticamente l'impatto sui mercati del lavoro, ma anche sull'organizzazione del lavoro, del cambiamento tecnologico intendo, e sulla formazione connessa a Industria 4.0. Questo è uno dei temi, diciamo, tradizionali dell'istituto, che è nato nel 1978 proprio per studiare le politiche della formazione, vocation, education and training, io credo che dovrebbe andare nella direzione specificamente di analizzare e fare proposte al policy maker sulla formazione connessa al cambiamento tecnologico. Che tipo di formazione serve? Dovrebbe studiare non soltanto l'impatto sul mercato del lavoro, ma anche l'impatto sul welfare, dalla prospettiva, we will discuss this afternoon with Marius, social investment. I mean, there are a lot of issues involved in this, Matthew effects and inequalities, but actually having an old welfare state, it produces many more inequalities than should be the case now. E io penso che l'istituto dovrebbe, come dire, virare nei prossimi anni marcatamente verso lo studio, appunto, future oriented studies, lo studio di social investment. Temi che abbiamo frequentato, che continuiamo a frequentare, c'è stato un grande convegno internazionale l'anno scorso e altri ve ne saranno sulla gig economy, sull'economia delle piattaforme e connesso a questo un tema di fondamentale importanza è quello delle relazioni industriali connesse al cambiamento tecnologico. Siamo in una posizione, diciamo, di vantaggio per studiare questi aspetti e credo che l'istituto dovrebbe anche qui, non solo relativamente all'economia delle piattaforme, ma in generale studiare la relazione tra il cambiamento tecnologico e industrial relations. La settimana scorsa in questo grande convegno, un giorno ma molto denso e molto interessante convegno che abbiamo avuto sulla, diciamo, realtà delle imprese, dell'economia italiana, abbiamo sentito ripetere una cosa che sappiamo molto bene, il gap di produttività dell'Italia non viene dalla manifattura, viene dai servizi, e c'è un grande deficit di produttività nei servizi, ma c'è anche, quasi paradossalmente, un grande deficit di occupazione nei servizi rispetto all'occupazione potenziale, che è anche legato al deficit di occupazione femminile che diciamo, trascina indietro questo Paese. Io credo che l'istituto potrebbe e dovrebbe studiare come utilizzare il cambiamento tecnologico, in particolare le opportunità offerte anche dalla silver economy e dalla blue economy in connessione al cambiamento tecnologico per affrontare questi problemi. Affrontare questi problemi, noi quello che possiamo fare è, da un certo punto di vista, condurre il cavallo dell'analisi e anche auspicabilmente delle proposte di policy all'acqua, ma non lo possiamo costringere a bere, o meglio condurre l'acqua verso il cavallo, mettiamola così, ma non possiamo costringere il cavallo a bere. Quello che possiamo fare è aumentare il grado di consapevolezza dei policy maker, dei media e degli attori economici su questi temi e su questo io credo che sia veramente fondamentale la comparazione. L'Istituto fa molto sull'Italia, dovrebbe ampliare il proprio spettro spettro di analisi e situare l'Italia in prospettiva comparata. Questo perché? Perché il policy making italiano è veramente troppo spesso provinciale, e lo vediamo anche con politiche, diciamo, in questi giorni, è troppo spesso provinciale, e quindi la conseguenza nella migliore delle ipotesi è che reinventa la ruota, e nella peggiore è che ripercorre strade fallimentari. L'ultimo punto, è davvero finito, che è il tema anche di questa sessione, cioè lo studio della politics. Capire che lo studio della politics, del cambiamento tecnologico, delle riforme, eccetera, è parte integrante della base conoscitiva da offrire ai policy maker per attuare le riforme stesse. La politics, le politiche per ridurre l'impatto distributivo, per compensare dinamicamente i perdenti, e il tema credo che sia di immediata rilevanza se pensiamo al di fuori dell'Italia ai giubbotti gialli in questo periodo in Francia, e all'impatto che queste dinamiche possono avere per le democrazie contemporanee, ma non solo, anche se pensiamo, e qui mi riferisco alla mia esperienza di policy maker, alle lezioni da trarre da recenti riforme in Italia. Con questo, e scusandomi per i colleghi per essere passato all'italiano, ma come dire, mi interessava, ecco, farlo perché restasse per l'istituto. Lascio la parola a Dario Guarascio per la sessione di oggi pomeriggio. Dario, the floor is yours.
Okay. Okay, so thank you very much. And before starting to chair this panel that I'm proud and pleased to chair for various reasons that I will briefly state in a minute, let me just thank the Director General and the President of this Institute, because without their support and the support in this event, nothing of that would have been realized. So I'm sincerely grateful for that. Then, I'm an economist, but I'm very keen to other disciplinary fields. I do things that interest to me. So complex phenomena quite always need, at least partly, an interdisciplinary approach, or at least with the only toolbox of economists, most of the complex problems that we are facing are not so easy to be understood and well analyzed. That's why I'm also very pleased to chair this panel and to have some such distinguished speakers that will present applied papers, so papers with quantitative evidence on the issue of the impact of technological change on socio-political preferences, but also the impact of technological change when we account for institutions as unions, for example, as one of the papers will tell us. And so the importance of this panel is at least twofold. For first, we will listen to presentation of frontier papers that are frontier papers not only because this is fresh evidence with very detailed data on complex phenomena as the impact of technological change on socio-political preferences, on voting, and so on, but also because this is a very newborn strand of literature, at least if we think at applied papers and at papers that allow us to compare evidence in different countries, so in places where the institutional setup is rather differentiated. So I think that I can leave the floor to the first speaker, and then maybe let some considerations to introduce the debate with the floor at the end of the presentations. The first speaker is Marius Busemeyer, Professor Busemeyer from Constance University. As has been said, a prominent scholar in welfare studies, a comparative political economist, and for sure someone who can tell us a lot of relevant and interesting things on how the current welfare state, but more than this, the welfare state that we can imagine as feasible in the future will adapt or will change due to the deep transformation that we are observing. So please, Marius, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much to you, Dario, for the nice introduction, and to you both, Stefano and Dario, for the invitation to participate and contribute to this conference. As you said, my contribution is framed in a positive way, frontier research, but in a more negative way, it's really work in progress. So it's this very fresh out of the workshop, so to speak. And so it's not a paper yet, but I have some hopefully interesting evidence that I would like to share. So it's actually, I have to, it's a little small, the thing. Is it possible to move? No. It's not. Okay, then I have to sort of maybe move a little bit over here. It's okay. I got it. So, that's fine. That's fine. I got good classes. So. Yeah, basically what I want to start, and actually we already talked about it this morning a little bit, that there's increasingly a lot of research or emerging research on the socioeconomic consequences of rapid technological change, the digital transformation on the labor market, and we will hear more about that tomorrow, and we already heard a lot about it today. But there is relatively little research so far on the political implications for welfare state policymaking, I would say. So taking the next step, basically, when you think about the implications of technological change on the labor market, you then sort of wonder what happens with the welfare state. How does the welfare state react to this? And then, of course, these public policies will be crucial, I think, regarding the long-term impact of technological change on things such as inequality and how exactly the digitalization of economies, the future of labor plays out in the long term. So I think this is a very crucial research topic, and there are just few people like Stefano and Aina and Zach that are starting to work on this really important issue. So basically, what I'm trying to look at here in this short contribution is the policy responses that are supported by public opinion. So I'm focusing more on the micro level implications. I'm not yet, so to speak, interested in the reactions of the policy making system itself, but more on the impact of these technological changes on public opinion, because to some extent public opinion matters for policymakers. And in a way, the question is, what kind of policy responses would the public like to see? And do we maybe see the emergence of new cleavages, new political conflicts related to this rapid form of technological change? Or do we rather see a reinforcement of existing cleavages, political cleavage structures in the welfare state? And so another focus of this presentation is going to be on the social investment welfare state, because or maybe I can actually already switch to the next slide, because as we already heard this morning, there are a lot of people, policy pundits, scholars, especially in the public debate, who would argue that the best response to the challenges of technological change is to increase spending, investments on education and training, or if you put it in a broader frame, you could say social investment, because social investment is not only related to education and training in the narrow sense, but also to labor market activation, to other forms of investment-oriented policies that are more forward-looking, that try to invest in the skills of people today in order to prevent the emergence of social problems later on. So I think of course, there's a lot of disagreement in the debate, but if there's one thing that most people can agree on, is that we should focus on education and training and human capital. But then the question is, what do the citizens actually think? On the one hand, citizens might support this turn towards the social investment welfare state, because they might understand that this is the best response to the new challenges. But on the other hand, we might also observe the opposite reaction when people are more worried about technological change and sort of retreat into their want to have some kind of protection from these forces. So we might also see, in terms of public opinion, a counter reaction where people, rather than adopting a forward-looking perspective to invest in the future, rather sort of go back and would like to be protected from what's going on, and so they would rather demand traditional social compensation policies. That's exactly the question that I would like to address in this little talk. And of course, there is likely to be variation across different groups, across different social classes, how exactly they react to this challenge of technological change. And I want to show you some very preliminary empirical analysis of survey data that I gathered. So this is survey data that is now publicly available, as you can see in the bottom of this slide. It's data that I collected in a project with my research team, and the project was funded by the European Research Council. Another example of how the European Union also creates benefits for us as researchers. We conducted a large survey in 8 European countries: Denmark, Sweden, UK, Ireland, Germany, France, Spain, and Italy. And we have about 9,000 observations in this data set, average response rate of 27%, which is, for this kind of survey data, telephone-based survey data, pretty good. And the data quality and representativeness is comparable to the European Social Survey, so we really try to get the best quality, and this is why it was also rather expensive to do. But we cooperated with a professional survey institute who actually did the survey using native speakers and careful translation of the questionnaire and so on. And the fieldwork of the survey was done in 2014. We have lots of questions about social investment policies, but mostly also about education policy, because that was a specific gap in the existing surveys, including the European Social Survey, which have quite a lot of questions about social policy, but very little on education policy. And so we really try to address that research gap by having this survey. It's called Investing in Education in Europe, in short, the INVEDUC survey. And as I said, it's now available in the public domain. This is the link on the GESIS data archive in Mannheim, and you can basically download it from there and use it yourself, and very happy to do so, as long as you sign our paper. But that's a cheap price to pay, I think. Well, so one part of this survey is this set of questions, and I hope it's at least a little bit better for you to read than for me on this little small screen. But what we're doing in this question is we are giving the respondents a number of policy proposals, new policy reforms that the government in their respective country might consider. And then they should just say whether they think this is a good idea or not, or whether they agree or disagree with this policy reform. And these policy reforms point in different directions. So some are pointing towards social compensation policies, some are pointing towards, or examples of social investment policies, and then also of workfare policies. And just to give you a short version of this, the first one is about giving the unemployed more time and opportunities to improve their qualification. This is a positive labor market activation policy. Expanding access to early childhood education and improving its quality. This is typical social investment policy. Investing more money in university education and research. Again, this is an example for social investment policy. Then forcing unemployed to accept a job quickly, even if it is not as good as their previous job. That's the workfare component, where you basically force people to get back on the labor market, even though they might actually suffer from that. And then increasing old age pensions to a higher degree than wages. That basically means put more money into pensions. And then finally lowering the statutory retirement age and facilitating early retirement. That's also social compensation policy. Of course, we could have thought of many other examples, but we try to choose the examples so as to represent the different directions that welfare state policy making might go. And then we did a factor analysis because ex ante you don't really know whether the answers to these items will correlate or not. And then actually we hoped, or we aimed at getting 2 factors, one for social investment and one for passive transfers. But as often is the case in social science, things never play out the way you plan. So we ended up with 3 factors, but these are rather stable across the different countries. There are some slight variations, but more or less they are stable across countries. And the first factor, not surprisingly, is really this social investment factor, which connects investments in early childhood education and universities, but also this positive measure of labor market activation. Then we have a very strong factor on passive transfers, which is the pension increase and expanding of early retirement. And then we have this workfare factor, which we actually didn't really expect to emerge, but there it is. So it's very high, loads very highly, as you can see from the positive. Maybe can I do this? No, that's not working. No. Is it this? Yeah. So here you see a positive value. That means it's loading very highly on that value. And this negative value simply shows that it's loading negatively. So it's negatively correlated to this positive labor market activation measure. So it's basically a very strong workfare factor. Then the surprising thing is when you look at this across different countries, to us it was pretty surprising what came out of here. If you look at the total, this is in this part, you actually see, first of all, social investment policies are really very popular. 80% of people or 75% of people agree or strongly agree that this is a good policy reform. But actually, workfare policies are surprisingly popular as well. So 60% of people agree or strongly agree with this kind of workfare policies. And that's maybe something that we usually don't want to realize, that these kinds of policies are actually quite popular. And the passive social transfer policies are the least popular. Especially in a country like Sweden and Denmark, of course, you have this kind of feedback effect that if you have already a very generous welfare state, people don't really see the need to expand a lot in that direction. But still, to us, it was quite surprising and a little bit of a contrast to the traditional discussion in the welfare state literature. But anyway, so especially the workfare component, that this is so popular, was to me very surprising. As you can see, even in Italy, 70% of people agree with the workfare reform. Okay, but now we're talking about. I should mention. Yeah, we also have. This is another standard item that I need for the empirical analysis. Is just simply support for redistribution, and I think Darius and Stefano's paper will tell you more about that. But this is sort of just a standard item in survey research. The government should reduce income differences between the rich and the poor. And there's one paper by Stefan Thewissen and David Rueda that just came out in Comparative Political Studies. One of the first papers that looks at the relationship between technological change or automation risk and support for redistribution. They are using this measure, and they find that there's a positive statistical association between automation risk and support for redistribution. So I'm just introducing that now because I need it later. So what we did now, or what my research assistant and I did for this paper is for this talk is to take the measures from Thewissen and Rueda of automation risk and apply it to our INVIDUC data set, basically, to see whether there's some link between automation risk and support for social investment policies or workfare policies. So we're using two measures that Thewissen and Rueda also use. One is the Fry and Osborne measure. We discussed the Fry and Osborne paper already this morning. So I guess most people know what it is about. It adopts a forward-looking perspective based on expert assessments of automation risk for a range of occupations. And then we also use the Routine Task Intensity Index, RTI index, following the work of economists such as Autor, Dawn, Goes, Manning et al., which measures the importance of routine tasks relative to manual and abstract tasks in a certain occupation. So both of these measures are correlated to some extent, but they're still not perfectly correlated, so there are some differences. We include a lot of control variables: income, educational background, gender, household composition, age, ideological orientation. And what we end up is this. What we end up with is this. This is the replication of the Thewissen and Rueda result, but using our data. And to some extent, we can confirm that, but only in this case here, where we have a positive association between automation risk. This is the Fry-Osborne measure, but only when we don't use controls. So whenever we use controls, which is the way you should do it, obviously, because automation risk is correlated with income and education, then the effects become much weaker and the confidence intervals go below, above the, or go include the zero mark. So basically, that turned out to be statistically insignificant, and I think that's more or less what other people are also finding there. So, but now the added advantage of our survey is obviously to look at whether there is some link between automation risk and these other social policy reform initiatives that we've looked at, especially social investment. And here again, the results are a little bit mixed, as is often the case. So this is support for workfare. Again, we don't really find significant results. It doesn't matter whether we include the control variables or not. It's basically not a strong result. We do find a result which is very similar to the redistribution measure for a positive association between automation risk and support for social transfer policies, but only when we don't use controls. Once we use controls, that sort of disappears. But then now the important thing is, of course, and this is a little bit counterintuitive, so I'm interested in hearing your opinion about that. Is there a link between automation risk and social investment support? And actually there is, but contrary to what you would expect, it's not positive but negative. So in a way, people who suffer from more automation risk are less likely to support social investment policies, and that's could be if it pans out in a more sophisticated analysis, and we need to do more analysis, obviously. Could be bad news for people who are promoting the social investment model as a potential solution to the challenges of technological change, because it shows that the people actually are not really. They would rather have social compensation or redistribution than social investment, it seems. We also ran some interaction effects, and for some reason, confidence intervals disappeared on that graph, but there are some confidence intervals around that. What we can see here is interaction effects, and that's interesting because this is the income effect, and you can see with higher levels of automation risk, you see that the negative income effect on support for redistribution disappears. So basically, it means as when automation risk increases, you see a stronger consensus emerging across social class that the state should intervene and do something about it. So that's at least positive news for people who want to promote the welfare state in response to technological change. With regard to social investment, it even becomes positive. So for high levels of automation risk, you do see that high income people become more supportive of social investment policies. Again, that's a more encouraging finding. And but if you use a different measure, it sort of goes in the other direction. So in a way, it's not really robust. So that was anticlimactic end of that argument. But anyway, so at least what this little exercise shows that there is some variation across groups, and that automation risk has this interaction effects, and we need to look more into the interaction effects maybe than just looking at the direct effect of technological change on support for social policies. Conclusion, so what? So I think what the little exercise shows that automation risk is somehow, of course, partly related to other factors like income and education, partly also independent, which you can see from the comparison of models with and without controls. I would say we don't see yet a new political cleavage. What we also see is a tendency for citizens in jobs with high automation risk to support compensatory policies rather than social investment. And also we see a mitigation of class conflict about redistribution for higher levels of automation risk. But of course, our survey does not cover new or radically different policy proposals such as the universal basic income. I'm actually planning to do more work on that in the coming years. And of course, I should say the analysis are still very preliminary. I need to run these models more properly. Thank you very much.
So many thanks, Marius. You maintain your promises. Things was frontier, very interesting, still ongoing, and things to discuss, but very interesting. And so I do think that the next presenter is a very good continuation of the things that we started discussing, because from welfare state and differentiated demand for policies to how do people vote and why do people vote in certain manners, and if risks, and in particular technology-related risks, might affect voting behavior. Please, Aina Gallego, from the Institut Barcelona de Estudis Internacionals.
Thanks. Can I have the pointer?
Yeah.
Thank you. So I think I will not need to convince you that digitalization is transforming many workplaces, and that there's increasing worry that machines will substitute humans. And this is like a few years ago, there was very little debate about this, but we have been seeing quite a bit public debate in recent years, and this concern that about the substitution of effects of artificial intelligence, robotics, and so on is quite widespread. But of course, we also know that the introduction of new technologies has like a more optimistic or positive side, and Georgios was referring to these dual effects, like the substitution effects of new technologies and the productivity effects. And if we think about people like ourselves, new technologies have mostly made us more productive, has made our jobs more interesting, probably increased salaries and so on. So there are these two consequences of technological change. One about the risk of substitution, and another one about the like increased productivity. And we know that the last wave of technological change, as it was mentioned before, so in Fordism, the complementarities between technology and the skills of workers favored low-skilled workers. In the last wave of technological change, which we call digitalization, so it encompasses information and communication technology, it's mostly the highly educated workers who have skills that are more complementary to computers. Okay, so this topic has received extensive attention in economics, and we are seeing this in the papers, and it was referred. But there's this growing intuition that perhaps technological change may have something to do with the rise of populism and may have some political consequences that are also relevant. And this was, I think Florian mentioned it. And so like at least these two trends go together in time. So we are seeing more digitalization, and we are seeing the rise of radical right-wing parties and so on. But in spite of the importance of this topic, and as was mentioned also before, there's very little robust and careful empirical research on the political consequences of digitalization. And so basically there's this paper that Marius was also talking about by Rueda and Cevisen, which was really a pioneering paper. But they use European social survey data, and it's a cross-sectional approach, and it's like a logical first step to do. But it does have some shortcomings. There's a second paper which was published last month on the effects of robots on support for Trump. And it's framed as like where you have more robots in the United States, you had stronger increases in the vote for Trump. And there's another working paper on Sweden with a similar idea as well. So that risk of digitalization helped the rise of the Swedish Democrats. We have very carefully read these papers, and we think there are some shortcomings, and we think more research is done to be able to really say something more conclusive. So first of all, in all of these cases, digitalization is only measured very indirectly through this routine task intensity measure, which is a proxy of risk, but actually does not, in the way it's measured, does not change over time, and it can be confounded with many occupational level characteristics. The identification strategies also are mostly correlational. And there's this, our more substantive critique is that by focusing a lot on losers, we may be a bit losing the broader picture, and we really try to test all of our hypotheses for also for beneficiaries of technological change, and we model the data in a way that allows us to see heterogeneous effects. So we ask, what are the political implications of digitalizations in the workplace for affected workers? So not for society as a whole, and this would be a super interesting question, but we look on what happens to the trajectory of one worker when their workplace is digitalizing. And are these effects of digitalization different depending on whether individuals are likely to be winners or losers of this process? So we discuss three main possibilities, and so the first is that it can, digitalizing work environments can affect turnout. So for the highly educated, they will have more resources, they are becoming more central, even like psychologically, or if you think about the Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, no? So more centrally politically as well, and may become more likely to vote. For the less educated, perhaps technological change is a bit different than other threats in that there's a shaming component. So if you think about trade, for instance, there's an out group, and it can be much more activating if your job is lost because it went to China, so you can fight against the Chinese. But if it's technological change, maybe this consequence should be more withdrawal from political life. So that's one of our hypotheses, and I think supported by a lot of work in psychology. A second hypothesis is about support for the left or right-wing parties. And so the idea here is old-fashioned, Meltzer-Richter inspired arguments on, well, when you are doing better economically, you will support for the mainstream right because they support lower taxes, which will benefit you. And the opposite is true for the less educated. I'm focusing on education, and this is a recurring question. What about RTI? I'll show later some results comparing education and RTI as the main dimension that predicts whether people will benefit or not from digitalization. And finally, the last hypothesis is that if you are doing well economically, you will support the incumbent, no matter who is in power. This is in line with the Frey paper on the US and other papers. And whereas if you are doing worse, you will have a blind punishment of whoever is in power, you will turn against this person. Okay, so to test this, we use data from the UK because basically because it's available for many years, and it's a high-quality survey data set that allows us to track the same person for over 20 years, and we can see how their political attitudes and also economic outcomes change when their industry digitalizes. So the data is available since 1991, but, well, as I will see, we are only able to use it since 1997. So we have these four variables that I discussed, so turnout, vote for the Conservative Party, for the Labour Party, and for the incumbent. We also look at Lib Dem, UKIP, and so on, but just not too overwhelmed with results. And so we end up with about 200,000 cases because of different reasons to why some data is lost. And we construct a new measure of digitalization, which is, it has been used in some economics papers, and it uses information on your industry. So we use the input-output databases calculated by EUCLEMS. They are quite standard, and they allow us to distinguish between ICT capital stocks and non-ICT capital stocks. So the idea is that your industry is becoming more digitalized if it's investing more in ICT, yeah? And we normalize it, we need to normalize because industries have different sizes. So we use this measure of ICT capital intensity relative to labor as our indicator of digitalization. So the idea, this is a measure that changes from year to year. Yeah. The descriptive, so we have 40 industries, and you can see that over time this scale is locked to visualize it better, but you can see that over time, as you would expect, there's increasing digitalization in our data set, and that it's more so in for some industries than others. And for the empirical specification, so I asked Dario if I should give a more technical or less presentation, but just to explain where these results come from. So we are using fixed effects models where we add a fixed effect for every individual industry spell. So it's like including a control for the all individual level characteristics that do not vary over time. So our results cannot be driven by people with different personalities or cognitive skills choosing different industries. Yes, so that's it really reduces concerns about selection. And also for in industry level characteristics. So at the end, we only use for identification the variation in an industry. So if in your industry that year there was more spending in ICT capital than predicted by the average of your industry over all years and the average trend across all industries. So we are left with one part of the variation, and that's what allows identification without concerns about self-selection and omitted variables, or at least minimizing them. It's not that they don't exist. So the first outcomes, they are a good validation of our approach, because we do find that for wages, if you are in an industry that is investing more in technology, you earn quite a bit more, in the order of £600 per year. But if you have no qualifications, you lose about £200 per year. So it's a meaningful economic effect. And for the probabilities to become unemployed, we do find that people who are less qualified and are in an industry that's investing a lot in ICT, they become more likely to be unemployed, but it's a very, very small effect. So it looks like that in the graph, but it's really tiny. So for political outcomes, we find, and that's, I think, our more novel finding, that these different economic trajectories are mirrored in different political trajectories as well. So winners, the results are more clear for these winners of digitalization, who are the highly educated. And so they become more likely to vote in elections. They become more likely to vote for the Conservative Party and more likely to support the incumbent party. Yeah, so it's a bit like our main story is for those who stay in their industry, when digitalization comes, they become more, generally they benefit economically, they become better off, and they react politically by supporting the status quo, which is a bit I'm glad to be the optimist, I hope, in the discussion, but we had very strong priors on losers, but we find very small effects actually on them. I promised a slide on education versus RTI, and partly because the small literature on the political effects only focuses on routine task intensity, and also the econ literature as the main occupation level characteristic that affects whether you are at risk or not. So our argument here is that the characteristics that are relevant at the aggregate level, so if jobs are lost or so, are not necessarily the same that are relevant at the individual level, and that education is probably a good proxy of people's ability to learn and adapt. So if I'm highly educated, maybe I'm in a routine job, but when there's change, I will have no problem retraining. And so people who have more of this education and cognitive skills probably are more able to reap the benefits of digitalization, like within their trajectories. With like this is all. Other results are on the aggregate or at regional levels. Our results are longitudinal, so it's important to highlight this difference. By contrast, we find very, very little difference between workers with high levels of education who are in routine or non-routine occupations. Yeah, so if you are highly educated and you are in a routine occupation, you benefit economically just as much as people in non-routine occupations. And that's probably because just there's upgrading, the task content of your occupation changes, and even if formally it's coded as routine, like for instance, these routine tasks, sorry if I'm going too much, but these routine indicators would code you in the same way in 1990 than in 2015, but a secretary in 1990 was doing a lot of routine work, and this person would always be coded as routine, but in fact, like a secretary today does very different things than they did before. So we think that, like there's a bigger issue here that we are still like fighting with, but we think that our approach is correct for at least for the question for the research question we have. By period, we break down because of course you will object. Oh, but the Labour Party. You are saying that like digitalization favors the Conservatives and the incumbent party, but in a big period of your data, it was the Labour Party that was in power. So how is this possible? No? So our argument is that probably both effects are happening at the same time. So if you do well economically, you favor the incumbent and the Conservative Party. So if there's a mismatch, both effects cancel each other out. And in fact, we find that before 2010, digitalization has no political effects, and these get much bigger after 2010. And we rule out that this is because of differences in the economic effects of digitalization, because actually in the two periods, they have the same positive effects. Yeah? So we are saying, well, it's not that digitalization has one political effect. It can have more than one, as many social like developments. You could object that perhaps government in the US, in the UK will direct policy or make industrial policy that favors or that tries to protect some industries, and that like this, for instance, invest more in technology and workers are more like grateful for the government, and that's why we observe the correlation. So there could be our design, even if it's quite demanding, could still have endogeneity. To address this, we use an instrumental variable approach, which is like using only the part of variation in digitalization in the UK that's correlated with digitalization in the US. And this is a quite standard approach in economics and in different papers. And this allows us to reduce, so it's credible because like the US is at the frontier of technology, and whatever happens on technology in the US is likely to affect industries in the UK. I'll wrap up quickly, just saying that our results hold using this more demanding identification strategy. We run a lot of other robustness checks. Like we use non-ICT capital instead of ICT capital as a placebo to rule out that it's just the industries that are booming in general that's driving our results. And we don't find the same effect. The idea here is that if your industry is booming, like what's specific about ICT is this heterogeneous effect on the highly and less educated. We use lead models to be able to include losers, so people who may have lost their jobs or gone to a different industry, and our main specification is losing, so we try to keep them in the estimation. We use different types of fixed effects models, exclude the more rapidly digitalizing industry, add region and year fixed effects, control for trade, clustered standard errors in different ways, and so on. And it's not that the results are exactly the same, but the picture overall is quite stable. And so just to, how much time do I have? Probably none.
No, 3 minutes.
3 minutes, perfect.
4.
Okay, so we find that there are these heterogeneous economic trajectories due to digitalization, and that they are mirrored in different political trajectories as well. And then the interpretation of the results, like we've had a lot of debate on the framing of the paper, because it's like, yes, but it's not a very clear message. So it's like, on average, digitalization is economically positive for workers. So we have many more workers who are benefiting from digitalization. They are just the majority, so these middle and highly educated groups. But it's also true that there's polarization, so that there's increasing inequalities. And until the moment we study, we don't see like a big political backlash of those losers, but it could be that we include the next wave of the survey, and then there's Brexit, and so it could be that there's some tipping point, or that people can tolerate some increase in inequality until a point where they no longer tolerate it. Yeah, so that's like we cannot make super sharp predictions from, but at least like overall the effects are positive. I would also like to emphasize like we've talked about a lot about robots, and there's this paper by Acemoglu and Restrepo on robots that many people are citing, like and also the like reports by different institutions saying, well, when there's robotization, jobs are lost and so on. Yes, but like robots is a very specific type of new technology, so that probably has a very high potential for substitution, whereas many other technologies are more have more potential for complementarities. And it's interesting because in this paper by Acemoglu and Restrepo, they have an appendix where they use 5 different measures of technological change. And they find that all of them have positive economic effects on jobs except for robots. But then the paper is about robots, and everyone gets the idea that like the technology is very threatening. No? So it's just to say that it depends on what measure of technological change you are using. You can have different results, and it's not the same to talk about. And, like technological changes are very broad. Yeah, and.
Okay, many thanks, Aina, for this inspiring and very interesting presentation. And as you will see, there will be point of attach with the final presentation of the panel. Thank you very much. So, left, right, turnout. If voters are in a way affected, and if there are some threats perceived or actual for workers due to technological change, we can think that unions, so the key institution that is expected to behave on behalf of workers, also to protect them or to interact in order to design a proper technological change, might matter. And so I ask Zach to tell us what happens when we plug unions inside the picture and we try to see empirically the impact of technological change on jobs. Thank you.
Thanks for the introduction. And can I steal the clicker from you? Cheers. Great. My name is Zach Perelin. I'm a doctoral researcher at the University of Antwerp in Belgium for about 4 or 5 more days, actually. So this is good timing. But we talked a little bit this morning about the role of organized labor in shaping the social consequences of automation. And that's precisely what I'm going to look at empirically within this paper. In particular, looking at the role of unions in the United States and collective bargaining in a cross-national perspective, and moderating that relationship between automation or technological advancements and differential occupational wage trends. So looking at the wages of high routine task-intensive jobs, these automatable jobs, compared to other types of occupations, and understanding if collective bargaining, if unions play a role in shaping those wage patterns. So I guess I don't need to go into too much detail on background and theory. We've been talking about this quite a bit, but in short, if we summarize routine bias technological change in a sentence, it's something like this, that technological advancements are generating declining demand for routine tasks. In other words, these occupations that are more routine in nature, so your manufacturers, your sales clerks, etc., are at increasing risk of being made redundant to these technological advancements. And the literature points to two primary sets of consequences. And the first, well, there's many, but when we talk about employment and wages, there's two big groups. First one is employment. Employment shares, we've seen in most advanced economies a decline in the employment shares of these high routine task-intensive jobs. Again, a decline in the share of manufacturers in the labor force, decline in sales clerks, office clerks, and so forth. And one interesting feature of these types of occupations is that they tend to be in the middle of the wage distribution. So in the bottom of the wage distribution, you have your low-pay, generally service sector type jobs. At the top, you have your CEOs, your managers, and so forth. But these automatable jobs are often right there in the middle. And so what happens when their employment shares decline, but the relative employment shares of these other occupations rise, we have what's called occupational or employment polarization. And again, we've cited some of these studies already, but Grossman and Solomons have found that occupational polarization, employment polarization, is pervasive throughout advanced economies. But I'm not going to focus much on employment. I'm instead going to look at occupational wages. We know, again, that due to automation, there's this potential of declining demand and declining relative wage growth for these automatable jobs. Sometimes this can lead to occupational wage polarization. Again, these automatable jobs in the middle, if they're seeing their wages decline relative to other types of occupations, that's what we call wage polarization. Happened in the US during the 1990s, but actually in other decades in the US and in other advanced economies, we haven't seen that pattern. And in most European countries, these automatable jobs still tend to be experiencing higher wage growth compared to these less automatable service sector jobs in particular. And part of what I'm going to try to do here is understand one driver that might be shaping these trends that we see more so here in the European Union as opposed to the United States. I talk more about this in the paper, but there's opportunities for further research. This first bullet point has changed a little bit in the last few years, but a lot of the initial automation research was coming out of the United States, which is fine, except for the fact that the US is very much an outlier with respect to the strength of organized labor in the country. Union levels were already low 20, 30 years ago, but they've been declining faster in the US than in most European countries, and that might affect some of the conclusions we've reached with respect to the social consequences of automation. And in general, there's been very little comparative work on the wages side and little understanding of how labor market institutions affect variance in the relative wage growth of automatable jobs versus other types of occupations. Why focus on labor market institutions? I don't think I need to convince many people in the room, but in short, we find from plenty of prior research that higher union coverage in a country, higher levels of collective bargaining coverage between countries or within countries over time is associated with lower levels of poverty, more compressed wage distributions, lower income inequality, higher wage premiums for these automatable jobs. And we've seen different patterns of different trends in levels of unions, levels of collective bargaining coverage across advanced economies. I mentioned the US, we've seen sharp declines, but actually in some countries in the European Union, I'll show you in a few slides, we've seen slight increases, not huge, but slight increases in bargaining coverage in recent decades. So I'm going to take advantage of some of that variation to try to see how that affects the relative wage growth of these automatable jobs. So a quick preview of the research question and some of the data and methods. I'll get into a little bit more detail in the next few slides. But I'm going to ask this: to what extent do changes in the level of unionization or collective bargaining coverage within a country affect the relative wage growth of automatable occupations? I'm going to use two different samples, and I'll explain why in a little bit, but the primary sample is cross-national. It's data from 15 advanced economies, mostly in the European Union, using the Luxembourg Income Study, which is a harmonized source of income data and employment data. And then I'll introduce a second sample, the 50 United States, using data from the Current Population Survey. Again, I'll talk about why I do that in a moment. Primarily looking at within-country variation from 1980 onwards, measuring the routine task intensity of all occupations in the data set, as we've talked about in the last couple of presentations. And what's important to keep in mind, I think, is that I'm only looking at between occupation wage differences in wage growth in this study. When we think about income inequality or wage inequality more broadly, we are getting the combination of these between job differences and the within occupation differences. I'm only looking at one of those for now. So I'm not going to make any grand claims with respect to wage inequality in this study. So here's what I'm going to claim, and then I'll give you some further reasons to believe in this hypothesis, and then we'll actually test it, of course. I'm going to argue that automatable occupations experience more favorable wage growth relative to less automatable jobs when levels of collective bargaining coverage within a country are stable or increasing. In other words, when bargaining coverage is declining at the national level, these automatable jobs are likely to experience declining relative wage growth, again, compared to these other types of occupations. But how can we understand this? Why might this be the case? Let's start with a simple premise. It's that a wage premium exists for a worker covered under a collective bargaining agreement, or in the United States, covered under a union contract, compared to, say, an identical worker who's not covered. This is backed up by plenty of research. I can show it empirically. But in general, if you have two identical workers, one is in a union and one not, chances are that one in the union has a slightly higher wage level than the other person. So if that is the case, then we can put forth two other scenarios why a decline in bargaining coverage at the national level is going to harm these automatable jobs in particular. And here they are. It could be that bargaining coverage is more consequential to the wages of these automatable jobs. Or it could be that when bargaining coverage declines at the national level, it declines at a faster rate among these automatable jobs compared to the other occupations. We can visualize this if you like. This is simply measuring the bargaining premium. That's the letter B. And nope, I clicked the wrong thing. The bargaining premium for a high routine occupation, simply the difference between the wage of someone who's working in this occupation but covered under a union contract or bargaining agreement compared to someone who's not. We can then split up wages in general. Let's say we have this competitive wage right here. That's just if you're, again, working in this occupation, earning the expected wage, not covered under a collective bargaining agreement. And if you are, then we add on this other part, the bargaining premium, if U is equal to 1 here, if you are covered under a bargaining agreement. And given that, we can estimate average wages. So average wage for a high routine worker, average wage for a low routine worker, just, again, the mean of that competitive wage plus the mean of the product of the bargaining coverage and union membership. If that doesn't make sense, don't worry. We'll get to some other empirical stuff in a second. So it could be, like I said, that bargaining coverage is more consequential to the wages of automatable occupations. So we can visualize that again. If the relative wage premium, the relative union premium or bargaining premium for an automatable job is higher than that of a low routine job, then losing union coverage or bargaining coverage is going to affect these automatable jobs more. And that's what I write. So if this is true, then a decline in bargaining coverage, even if it's equally distributed across all types of occupations, will contribute to declining relative wage growth of these high routine occupations. Now, is there evidence to back this up? Yes, there is. In the US data, but not the cross-national data, we can test this empirically. In short, we see that the results suggest that's the case. And we can move on to that other scenario. Bargaining coverage might decline at a faster rate among these automatable jobs when bargaining coverage at the national level declines. If that's the case, bargaining coverage among these high routine jobs declines faster, then again, the average high routine occupation might experience a relative decline in wages, even if, say, the bargaining premiums are equal. And we can demonstrate that empirically as well. This is, again, using US data. High routine occupations are seeing declines in union coverage in the US at a faster rate than other types of occupations. And if you look at data from the European Social Survey as well, from 2002 onward, you can find a similar trend. So there's some reason to believe this hypothesis that when bargaining coverage is declining at the national level, it's particularly bad for these automatable jobs. I'm not going to talk much about two other potential effects here, but they are in the paper. The first is a possible employment effect. So maybe it is the case that, okay, higher bargaining coverage contributes to higher relative wage growth for these jobs, but does it come at a cost, perhaps? Does it come at the price of employment shares of these types of occupations? We can test that. This has its roots in the dualization literature or the insider-outsider literature in economics. This says that, sure, these automatable jobs can achieve their higher wages than the market might otherwise pay them, but perhaps at the expense of these labor market outsiders, these low-skill workers, new labor market entrants, other job seekers, etc. it could actually accelerate employment polarization if this is the case. And then looking at a possible investment effect, we saw EU CLIMS data on ICT capital investments in the prior paper. I used the same in this paper at the industry level, and try to see, does increasing bargaining coverage within a country actually discourage employers from investing in some of these productivity-enhancing technologies, basically slowing that shift in demand away and preventing that job or wage loss for these automatable occupations. Okay, so which type of data am I using? In this primary sample, the cross-national look, I'm using data from what's called the Luxembourg Income Study. And what LIST does is brings data from about 40 countries over 40 years into one data framework, so you can compare apples to apples. You can look at incomes in this country compared to incomes in this country and not have to worry so much about harmonization. So I have data on 15 advanced economies from 1979 onward, a sample of 1.4 million employed adults. I'm measuring the routine task intensity of all occupations in the data set. So I can look at the job and I can predict or make some kind of judgment as to the likelihood that this job is automatable compared to other jobs, for example. And in this cross-national sample, I'm going to measure bargaining coverage at the national level. So the economists in the room might be panicking a little bit. They're visualizing something like this. You know, we're looking at the moderating role of bargaining coverage on this relationship between technological change and relative wages of automatable jobs. But wait a second, there might be a relationship here as well, and that's not good for the analysis. It could be that automation, technological advancements, have a mechanical effect on declines in bargaining coverage as well. For example, in the United States, union coverage is primarily concentrated in industry, say manufacturing workers. So if automation is replacing these manufacturing workers, then of course there's a relationship between automation and union coverage as well. Again, that's not great for the analysis. So what do we do about it? This is my solution. We introduce a second sample and do one thing a little bit different. 50 United States, data on 1.9 million employed adults. The only change I'm making now is I'm measuring bargaining coverage only among those automatable jobs at the state and industry level. So even if the share of these manufacturers declines, I'm still measuring union coverage just among those manufacturers that are still in the system to try to get around a little bit that issue of endogeneity. So we have two samples. We're going to run the exact same estimates on both to try to figure out, does bargaining coverage matter for the wages of these automatable jobs, more so than for other jobs? What is an automatable job? It's important to define. So I split up all the occupations into three groups. The first, as you can see, is this high routine task intensity category. These are the automatable jobs. How do I choose them? I just take the top 1/3 of the distribution of the routine task intensity distribution. So these are the top third of jobs that are, say, more automatable compared to others. Manufacturers, sales clerks, etc. And then what's interesting about all these other jobs is that automatable jobs tend to be in the middle of the wage distribution. So these low routine jobs can be at the top, your CEOs and managers, or they can be at the bottom, your service sector workers. And so I simply split those up into two different categories. So now we have these three categories of workers. And in a couple slides, I'll visualize this to make it a little bit clearer. A lot of data here. I mean, you don't need to read it all. The important thing I want to point out is we can look at different job titles of these automatable occupations in the list data. What's interesting, in the US and these non-US countries, you see that this is the wage divided by the median. Both are close to 1. What this is telling us is that these automatable jobs, again, tend to be near the middle of the wage distribution. So we split these occupations into three types. We can visualize this a little bit more. On the x-axis, we have the wage distribution. On the y-axis, the routine task intensity of the occupation. This is standardized. So these bars up here are high routine task intensive. These are the automatable jobs. Again, mostly clustered in the middle here. These are the high pay but low routine task intensive jobs down here. And the dark gray bars, your low pay and low routine task intensive jobs. So these are the three groups we're going to look at. I'm going to summarize this very briefly. So this is the estimation strategy. And I'm going to start by just estimating the wage trends of these high routine occupations compared to, again, these low-pay occupations and the high-pay occupations. And to do that, I'm just going to estimate the wages of each individual in the data set. I'm using dummy variables, so this is simply an indicator, yes or no, of is the individual in one of those high-paid jobs? Is the individual in one of those low-paid jobs? And the reference group, so not displayed here, is that automatable category, the high routine occupations. So what beta 3 here is showing us, for example, it's this dummy interacted with the linear time trend. All it's going to tell us is, are high-pay occupations, CEOs and managers, experiencing faster wage growth on average compared to automatable jobs? This is going to tell us the exact same thing, but our low-paid jobs on average growing at a faster rate than automatable jobs, independent of age, education, sex, and controlling for country, industry, year, fixed effects. But the interesting part, of course, is when we bring collective bargaining into the mix. So I'm using this exact same equation, but just adding a triple interaction here. CBC is collective bargaining coverage. So do we see, for these low-pay and high-pay occupations, that their wage growth relative to automatable jobs depends on changes in collective bargaining coverage within the country? And again, now I have these two samples. In one, I'm measuring bargaining coverage at the national level, because that's the best I can do there. And in the other, I'm measuring it among automatable jobs at the state and industry level. So we'll look at some descriptive patterns first. What I'm showing here is the indexed wage growth of high routine jobs relative to high-paid jobs, non-routine, and relative to low-paid jobs. And then I also show changes in bargaining coverage within the country. So let's look at the United States first, because this clearly fits the hypothesis I put forward. You see this dashed line here, that's the decline in union coverage within the US, the closest thing the US has to bargaining coverage. And you see these declining lines here mean that high routine jobs are experiencing declines in wage growth compared to high pay and low pay jobs. That matches the hypothesis. A little bit similar in Germany, slight decline in bargaining coverage, slight decline in the wages of those automatable jobs compared to others. A little bit the same in Canada. Greece is a funny case, of course, labor market reforms, bargaining coverage crashes here, but not much difference in wage growth between the occupations. This is another group of country that saw little to no change in their bargaining coverage. Again, Denmark doesn't really fit the story well. You can see stable or slightly increasing bargaining coverage, but still those automatable jobs are losing in Denmark. Austria fits the story, not much difference in wage growth here. We can look at countries that saw a very slight increase in bargaining coverage. So Finland, for example, again, not much difference in occupational wage trends here, fits the story. France, a little bit as well. The Netherlands, you see a decline here in automatable wages compared to low-pay wages, but also coinciding with the decline in bargaining coverage, so perhaps. These are descriptive statistics. We can also look at the estimation results that I showed you earlier. Again, a lot of numbers on one side. I'll translate it on the other side, so don't worry if you're unable to see this from all the way back there. This first sample is just those 15 advanced economies, mostly throughout the European Union, and then we'll look at the US data in a minute. But let's ask this first. Are the wages of high routine occupations, these automatable jobs, growing more slowly on average than low routine occupations? And the answer is yes and no. Okay, we see that low pay, so your service sector jobs, are slightly, on average, gaining ground on these high routine occupations, controlling, again, for age, education, sex, and so forth. But we don't see any significant differences here between the high pay and automatable occupations. Is this conditional on changes in collective bargaining coverage in the country? In other words, do changes in collective bargaining coverage affect the relative wage growth of these automatable jobs? And the answer is yes. We see from this higher bargaining coverage within a country is associated with greater wage growth of these automatable jobs compared to low pay, less routine jobs in particular. And I'll visualize this in a couple slides so you can understand the magnitude of these effects as well. But real quick, let's go to our US sample. Do we see the same findings here? Again, we're measuring bargaining coverage at the state and industry level just among those automatable jobs. And the short answer is yes, we see the same results. Higher bargaining coverage associated with greater wage growth of automatable jobs relative to low routine occupations. So does it matter? Are these big numbers or small numbers or what? We can, in the last slide here, I think there's a couple more slides, we take a look at that. Now again, 3 lines is kind of confusing, but I'll try to explain it as clear as I can. What we're looking at is the wage growth of these automatable jobs compared to low-pay service sector jobs, indexed at their 1984 values. So look at this black bar, for example. This is the observed pattern. You see the declines over time. This is declining relative wage growth for these highly automatable occupations. But what if union coverage in the US did not decline from 1984 levels? What would these wage trends look like instead? That's this gray bar here in the middle. And you see by 2015, rather than experiencing a decline compared to these low-pay service sector jobs, they would have wage growth on par, almost equal to these low-pay service sector jobs. And what if we can imagine some sort of outlandish scenario where union coverage in the US actually increases at a 0.5 percentage point per year rather than declining at that rate? Well, of course, these automatable jobs fare much better. Last thing I want to show, we talked a little bit about occupational wage polarization when these wage growth in these middle jobs, these automatable jobs, declines at a faster rate than others. In the US, that was the case in the 1990s. You see that declining bar right here. In this counterfactual scenario where union coverage does not decline, you see we still have a little bit of polarization, but to a lesser extent. And at the top, in this sort of made-up scenario, which wouldn't occur in reality, and we see that there wouldn't be polarization. This isn't to say that declines in bargaining coverage are responsible for occupational wage polarization, but it does seem to have some effect on these trends in wages we're seeing among automatable jobs. I'm going to go through these very fast. Does it come out of cost? Do we see employment effects or investment effects? Short answer is I don't find support for it within my data, but that doesn't mean that the answer is no. We don't see employment effects in either sample. We don't see disinvestment effects in either sample. Instead, it appears to be the case, as I talked about earlier, that bargaining coverage is more consequential for the wages of those high routine jobs and also declining at a faster rate for those jobs. So what do we take away from this? One, that changes in bargaining coverage within countries affects the relative wage trends of automatable jobs. We see that declines in bargaining coverage and union representation appear to affect the wage growth of high routine occupations more so than low routine occupations, and stable or increasing levels of bargaining coverage might contribute to a lack of wage polarization in many European countries. Does it come at a cost? Does higher wage growth for automatable occupations lead to decline in employment shares or declines in investment? I don't find support for it, but there's more work to be done in this area. And I'll end with this. It is perhaps the case that the social consequences of automation are conditional on welfare state and labor market institutions within a country. It doesn't have to be the case that the effects of automation are inevitable. It doesn't have to lead to all these awful social outcomes. It seems like organized labor has some say over how the wages, at least, of these occupations evolve. So, thank you.
So, thank you, Zach. I already appreciated in Vilnius this paper presentation, and I appreciate it again now, and I found it very interesting. I have some comments for the end. So, I think that the time is right to leave the floor to Stefano and deepen a little bit some things that have been already tackled partly, at least, by Marius and Aina, but what Stefano will show you enters both within the discussion and the literature on the socio-political impacts of technological change, but also within a very hot debate in Italy concerning redistributive measures aimed at supporting income, which, as we know, might be very different in terms of design, and we try to see to what extent these are also differently related to risks, technology-related risks. Stefano, please.
Okay, thanks very much. If I can have the presentation. Very good, thank you. This is I don't know whether this is frontier. This is definitely work in progress, though. And so work in progress that panelists got a paper that now, I mean, is an older version, and actually, I mean, we just found some new results, interesting results that, to a certain extent, subvert, I mean, the previous result, only to a certain extent. And so, I mean, we look forward to your comments. This is a paper that I'm writing together with Dario and with Silvia Vannutelli at Boston University. So I think I don't have to go through all the blah, blah, blah about the things. I mean, we all are well acquainted about this. And actually, I mean, we keep on repeating. I mean, there's only one paper, Tavisse and Rueda. We wrote 2017 because it was pre-pub. Tavisse, actually, no. I mean, this is no longer the case insofar as, I mean, we are all working on this. So this is reassuring in a sense. So next round, I mean, it won't just be Tavissen or Tawissen and Rueda. Actually, the focus of this paper is on Italy, and the basic idea is to look at the I mean, relationship between exposure to risk of technological unemployment through both RTI and another more subjective measure that I will tell you something about immediately. The impact of this on preferences for redistribution, but not the generic preference for redistribution that is there in the ESS, that is being used by Tawissen and Rueda, but specific questions about what? About UBI, Universal Basic Income, and generalized minimum, GMI, generalized minimum income. I will tell you something about this immediately. And the focus is on Italy for several reasons. Of course, this is an important policy debate in Italy. Italy was the last EU country not to have introduced a minimum income scheme. It actually introduced it in 2017 as of 1st of January in 2018 as of 1st of January 2018 after a long gestation. And a minimum income scheme, but then, I mean, there was a debate about yet another, actually, minimum income scheme that, however, I mean, was mostly perceived to be a UBI. This is not the case, definitely not the case. Reddito di Cittadinanza is promoted by one of the parties that is currently, I mean, comprising the government, this coalition supporting the government. So actually, I mean, in the Italian public debate, there was a basic misunderstanding about this measure that was a GMI but was believed to be a UBI. It doesn't matter. I mean, this is important, but however, I mean, the measures that we use for support for these two redistributive measures are independent of the debate. However, because they come from the 8th round of the European Social Survey, and we actually take advantage of this round insofar as, on top of the usual questions regarding support for governmental redistribution and lots of other variables that we use as controls. Actually, in the 8th round of so the fielding was 2016, 2017, and it was 2017 for Italy. Actually, INAPP, like I said, I mean, did it, so it was fall 2017. There was a rotating module, so a specific module with lots of questions, additional questions on welfare, including questions on inter alia support for UBI. and also questions on that we use as indicators of the what is generally called the cultural dimension of politics, that is support for, let's say, migrants getting access to, you know, the welfare state. So social services and social protection, never immediately, only if they work after a year. And so it's a very good question that we use, you know, as a proxy of the cultural dimension. On top of this, you know, national authorities, member states of the ESS consortium, ESS area consortium, can introduce additional questions. And this is what we did at INAPP, introducing additional questions, several additional questions, but the ones that are relevant here are one question on support for GMI. Okay, so all ESS countries have this question on support for UBI. Italy also has this question support for GMI. That was important because at the time GMI hadn't been introduced in Italy. So just assessing support for UBI without, you know, a benchmark would have been would have introduced some distortion, we thought. And also questions on a split sample on let's say, individual perception of whether, you know, your own occupation is at risk of being your own job is at risk of being substituted by machines. So the question goes like, out of 100 people, you know, doing your same job, how many do you think will lose their job because of machines over the next 10 years? And so this is a specific question for Italy. So alas, this is all about Italy. However, we have lots, I mean, we have, you know, an edge that comes from the fact that we have so many variables and so many controls. Okay, and yeah, I think I can go on, and then I mean regarding data sets, of course, we also make use of RTI, so the routine task measures, using this Italian ONET. So this you know, let's say, purges use of, you know, introducing use of RTI measures based on US ONET linked to, let's say, French or German dynamics. Okay, and the question is the following one: is there a relationship between exposure to tech unemployment risks and policy preferences with respect to redistributive policies and specifically UBI and GMI? Okay, I told you already a lot about this. So these are two, let's say, dependent variables. You know, UBI, support for UBI and support for GMI on a 5-point scale, and are, you know, main independent variables are routine task index and perceived risk of tech unemployment, like I said. Lots of controls. First and foremost, we use the usual outcome variable, which is the general preference for distribution as a control. Lots of other controls, socio-demographic control, gender, age, education, blah, blah, blah. Individual employment characteristics, income-related variables. So whether your household is struggling for on present income, which is you know, a standard ESS question, and we also calculated whether your household income is higher than the median income. Then we have, in the last column in the regressions that I will show, include social classes, the USH 5 class, let's say, reduction. Okay, we don't use more because, I mean, they are highly collinear with, of course, RTI and with through ISCO. So, I mean, if we use the, what is it, the 16, I mean, of course, we are introducing a lot of collinearity. politics, left, right, we recorded and we are going to have some results, and this proxy for the, or indicator for the cultural dimension of politics that I already mentioned. We also have controls in terms of individual perception of his or her own risk of unemployment in the next years, which is again, I mean, a question that comes from the welfare model, and then, I mean, individual estimate of the overall unemployment level in the economy. And we use the distance of this to the actual level of unemployment in the economy. Union membership, regional controls, they are important in Italy, north, center, south. Exposure to trade at the regional level. Unemployment rate at the regional level, and increase or variation in unemployment, but it generally increase, variation in unemployment rate between 2006 and 2016. So many controls, and actually something that I'd like to say is that about the UBI and GMI, why are they not directly related to the political debate? I mean, because actually they are. I mean, one actually criticism could be, yeah, I mean, since the debate is so heated, you know, you hint at some you basically hint at for the respondents to link this to the political debate. Actually, we don't, because both in the welfare model of the ESS and in our question regarding GMI, both UBI and GMI are described in institutional, let's say, program design terms. So simply, I mean, would you be in favor of a program or a measure that has the following characteristics? And it's 5 or 7 characteristics that are, of course, some or many differ between UBI and GMI. So there is no direct reference to reddito di inclusione or reddito di cittadinanza. Now, preliminary, I know that this will be part of Dario's presentation of tomorrow. Actually, I mean, there is an impact in the Italian labor market of exposure to, you know, of RTI, of routinization. And actually, I mean, these are changes in employment levels. Tomorrow, Dario will show employment shares, changes in employment shares. That is actually, I mean, what we should be using, but you know, prima facie, you can detect a pattern, and so an impact of high routinization on employment dynamics in Italy. And these other descriptive statistics. This is support for basic income and minimum income by quintile of RTI in Italy, and you see. You actually see that both, you know, are widely supported, with GMI being supported more than UBI. How much time do I have? 5 minutes?
Yeah, even 7.
Okay. Thank you. So, some results. This is support for basic income, and we only highlight, I mean, are relevant variables, but there are so many controls, trust us. And you see, I mean, the first column is all employed using RTI. The second is only using, you know, the subjective measure of exposure to tax change. The third one, you know, plugs them together. The fourth one introduces an interaction, which is the basic difference with the paper that was circulated, that makes a difference. And the last column introduces social classes, because actually you see that these results are quite robust, even when we plug in social classes that are highly correlated through the ISCO with RTI. And so these results seem to us very, very strong, and they basically tell you that, as you can read, for those individuals who are objectively more exposed to risk of substitution by machines and who have a higher RTI, the higher the individual perception, the higher the support for UBI. So that's a strong result, we think. And we can detect positive correlation with the estimated individual risk of being unemployed in the next years and with being part-time, but not with other labor, individual occupational characteristics. A negative correlation with, gender. Female respondents are less keen, all other things being equal, on supporting UBI. And in a puzzling way that we still have to understand, with variables capturing regional unemployment. So the higher regional unemployment, the lower the support for UBI, all other things being equal, and we also include interaction terms, but it's difficult to make sense of this, but we will manage. Support for minimum income. Here, we have some problems in the sense that if we don't include interactions, there is a detectable impact of a high RTI on support for GMI, which is the result of the paper and of the draft paper. This still is there with interaction, but no social classes. Social classes, then the introduction of social classes absorbs all. The variance. There is positive correlation with high income, support for GMI, high income, education, support in the left, and higher variation of the unemployment rate between 2006 2016. Okay, these are controls, but we think they are important, to discuss. And also strong positive correlation with income support to migrants working since at least 1 year. So this measure of a la Creasy and Heusermann distributed deservingness that is there. A negative correlation with union membership, which might be puzzling or not. Not so puzzling, again, Creasy, Heusermann find strong results. And if you're a union member, you're more in favor of universalism. And so this is, again, this is based on distributive deservingness. So I guess this is the way to make sense of all this. Having children at home, which is beau, and overestimation of actual employment rate. So the higher your overestimation of actual employment rate, the more you are against, or the less you support GMI, regional trade openness, and interaction between regional trade openness and regional unemployment rate. So this result for GMI is a bit puzzling. We still have to look into that. Some effects, but then the more you add, the more this absorbs GMI, and then we did something more, and this will be my last empirical slide. Okay, you may support GMI, which is, let's say the extension of those who support GMI is comprised of those who support both GMI and UBI and those who actually support GMI but not UBI. So we actually looked at this subset, okay, of the extension of supporters of GMI, only those who support GMI. And actually here there should be two columns, okay? They are, I put all the results in one only. And for those who only support GMI, actually the impact of both high RTI and separately high exposure, individual perception of exposure to risk of tech unemployment is actually significant and with the right sign. Actually, then I mean the interaction has a negative effect, and maybe you can help us making sense of this. But this is very preliminary. We do have to look into this, and all the other, I mean, correlates keep the same sign as the previous chart. So key results: the Italian case displays high levels of support for both redistributive measures, UBI and GMI, with the highest support for GMI, thus for this kind of means-tested conditional measure, and we take it as an indication or as evidence of distributive deservingness. For those more objectively exposed to the risk of tech and unemployment, higher subjective risk perception increases support of UBI, but results are mixed for GMI, as I just discussed. Another take-home is support for UBI is there across the political spectrum, okay? You cannot detect any differences between center, left, and right, whereas support for GMI correlates with the left, with being supporting the left, inclusion of migrants if they work, education, and it is reduced by union membership. I think I can leave it at that. Thank you so much.
Okay, so many thanks, Stefano, and many thanks to you all. So just one key warning. I bargained with the coffee break guys outside that if we would like to start discussing now and having the discussion that I hope we will have, we have half an hour and no more than this, otherwise we will have no coffee and no anything outside. Otherwise, we can choose to have coffee now and go back for discussion, but I don't believe we will do this. So
you can find good coffee in Italy everywhere. So I mean, we can go on for hours.
Okay. So
beware of the friends.
So let's have half an hour of substantial discussion. So I think I will first open the floor for 3, maximum 4 questions, and then use those also for have a quick debate among speakers. Are there points? And being brief will be very welcome in order to the half an hour constraint that we have.
Of course. Since you have to be aware of the friends, I'm afraid that it's a very tiny question for your paper, Stefano. I see that you have no significant results in the more complete specification of your models. I'm afraid that once you plug the social class into the model, you have a large overlapping between the social class and the RTI index. So probably you don't have enough variation conditional on social class. So that's a statistical problem, probably, since you have only 300 observations. So probably that's the problem in your model.
Thank you. Just a question for the last paper, because I'm sorry I was late, so I couldn't listen only to the final presentation. Another friend, beware of the friend. I'm very interested in the effect of, the perception of the risk of being unemployed in general and the perception of the risk of being unemployed because of technology. So I was wondering whether it's possible in your model to measure the two effects somehow separately, at least with an interaction. So conditional on the fact that I think that I will lose my job for whatever reason, the fact that in addition to that, I think that it is due to technology, does it make any change? So something like an interaction or something. I don't know if you've tried it or if you think it's worth doing it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting presentations. Just a couple of specific questions, then one overall comment. Just for Zach, I'm just wondering, a lot of your analysis with the relative, it was the relative fortunes of the 3 groups. So, and I mean, it's really an interesting addition to the union effects literature. there's no economic damage, but it's protecting workers relative in certain situations. But I'm wondering, is this within the overall context of decline for all groups, or is that so? That's the question there. And I suppose the other was there seemed to be a tension between the finding that education increased the attitudinal gap. I might have got this wrong, but within in high automation settings versus the income gap in attitudes decreased as automation increased. Income and education are different, and I suppose that's part of my question. Are income and education two different things in this setting? Income being your current situation and education being your protection into the future in this kind of setting. And then the last comment just overall, which was, I guess, just picking up on your very interesting comment that we focus on the bottom too much and not enough on the top. And we found this in our attitudinal research that who is opposed to redistribution? People who are wealthier, in better situations. And in general, in our research and kind of this redistribution question, the people who really depart from it are the people who are the best off. So in a sense, that's consistent. And really where you see the inconsistencies are people who are disadvantaged. So in a sense, you could maybe reinterpret the current political situation as the elites at the top are acting coherently in their own interests, and those who are being left behind are having all of these contradictory findings where they don't support social investment, they don't support basic income because even though regional unemployment is high and so on. So it's just...
Thank you. Yes, a question for Parolin. I really appreciated your work. I just want to ask something that maybe is a bit out of topic. You will tell me. So we know now that actually labor share and the role of union affect also income inequality. Even IMF has recently published many papers where they say they stress the relation between union coverage, labor share, and wage inequality and distribution of wealth. So my question is a bit further. Do you think that the degree of union coverage and union strength may also affect the direction and the development of specific technologies? In the sense that is there only a question of really technology and content of routinarity, or is there also a role of social relation in terms of power relation that affect the direction and make such that a specific kind of workers are the more affected by technology or not? Thank you.
So I think we have enough material before leaving the ground to the speakers to respond and to.
There's another question.
Another question. Okay, so that one, and then we start discussing.
Yes,
please.
Thank you very much. I have two short questions, one for Angie and one for Stefano. So the first one is, what about the distortionary effect of the Westminster model on actual voting choices? So do you plan to test your model also on systems where the election rules, the electoral system is less distortionary on the sincerity of voting choice? Second question is, okay, you have this counterintuitive result about the interaction between two drivers of social solidarity or solidaristic attitudes. Maybe the interaction reveals that these two variables work on different channels. So maybe on the one hand, you can have some kind of institution based channel of solidarity, driver of solidarity, and on the other variable you have a more structural economic based individualistic driver of solidarity. But when the two interact, when you make interact the two, you reveal that these two variables operate in different directions. So if I am in a routine activity, maybe because I am unionized, because maybe I am more sensitive to centralized bargaining dynamics, I tend to be solidaristic. But if I am in that occupation and I also fear to lose that, then I lose that kind of impact, I lose that kind of driver and become more selfish. This could be an hypothesis to explain the counterintuitive result. Thank you.
Okay, so three flash comments that I think apply to both Marius, Aina, and one specific to Zach, and then let them discussing. The first one maybe is a bit naive, but I mean, since you are interested, and this is a crucial point, on demand for policies, its structure of this demand and how it can be reshaped by the phenomena that we are dealing with. My point is, isn't that, and maybe this is the case, that things like technological change joined with globalization reshapes society and social groups in a way that reshapes even the structure of this demand for policies? And if there is still a demand for certain specific kind of policies, maybe in a context in which uncertainty has reached some critical levels, let's say, or fragmentation within society has reached some very high levels. And this lead me to the question to Zach, that is in a way a problem, if you want, of general reverse causality. I mean, in the framework that you are proposing, the fact that as a kind of contextual factor, membership in union is declining might affect the way how the link between routinization and so technological change and wages takes place with the action of unions. But we also do know that internalization of production, this articulation of production, also related to the deployment of ICTs, has a lot to do with the impoverishment and even the changing shape of the activities of unions. I mean, in Europe, we have a history of this. So, I mean, if it is not the case to frame the meaning of unions and of their actions in a socio-economic context that is more and more fragmented, more and more internationalized, and where technology plays a key role in this setting. I mean, this is more food for thought. And this is finally to Aina, and I agree with the Westminster model comment that has been made. I mean, since, you know, I know that you control for a lot of industry level controls that in a way clean out for some regional or industry specific characteristics. But in a way, I can think that some relevant groups like those who do not vote, those who voted for UKIP in very specific regions or regions where sectors are large in the UK might have behaved in a different way as compared to the average results that you have shown. So maybe you can test subsamples as long as the observations and the variables that you have allow you to do this in order to see if, I don't know, not voting or voting for the UKIP, but in a specific area where maybe sectors are more relevant, then lead you to kind of different results. So I don't know if Zach would like to start, and then we do like this, or I don't know.
Yeah, that sounds good. Thanks for the questions. First, I'll start with the one about relative versus, say, absolute wage trends. What is driving those relative trends we see when there's higher increase in bargaining coverage, looking at real wage growth? In short, the answer is for these high routine occupations, when bargaining coverage among these occupations is higher, we expect higher real wage growth compared to the baseline for these occupations. So in this data, the wages of these occupations in most years aren't declining. I mean, they're not experiencing declining real wage growth, stagnant often. But what we see in this counterfactual scenario is even greater wage growth. What's interesting, though, is that for the low routine occupations and the low pay variant in particular, you find that when bargaining coverage is higher among these automatable jobs, we see not declines in real wage growth, but declines compared to the observed, declines compared to the baseline. And what I think is going on, but I haven't tested this explicitly, and I'm still trying to think how, is that it's operating through labor supply, or at least that's my initial hypothesis, that, again, these high routine occupations can experience this higher wage growth, but perhaps in the process, pushing labor supply downward towards these low-pay service sector jobs, increasing competition among these jobs, which is dampening some of that wage growth that might be observed otherwise. But that's speculation, and I need to go back and test it more. A couple questions about the role of unions and many things. I mean, one, the endogeneity problem in general with measuring the relationship between levels of bargaining coverage or unions and wage growth and automation is tricky, and I don't fully get around it in this paper. I have some ideas on how we can do that, at least within the US data moving forward, but I agree that there's a lot going on and it's hard to disentangle all of it. The same applies to the question back there. I mean, I think it's a good question and I don't know the answer, so I'm not going to give a very good answer. But I think it's worth investigating. Do unions shape some of the investment inputs? I test that a little bit with this investment effect, but I don't find a lot of evidence for it. And the literature is a bit mixed on whether this capital holdup problem is real in general. But they seem to certainly shape some of the social consequences, again, looking at the wage growth. But I don't have a better answer for your question, but I think it's a good one and worth investigating.
Okay, thanks also from my side for the comments. And maybe starting with Darius' point that technological change might sort of change the whole demand side of policies. I think that's exactly the question, and whether technological change leads to a new political cleavage potentially, whether we see RTI or some other measure explaining more in attitudes than income or education. And so far, I think we don't see it yet. But yeah, we have to watch out for it. But I think the kind of survey analysis that we're doing would be able to capture that. So I think it doesn't invalidate the whole survey-based approach, but we need to be aware of how these different measures are connected. And then on the point about the confusion maybe on, I think that's a very good observation that there's a lot of uncertainty as to which kind of policy responses we would need, and it's easier to stick with the status quo if it works nicely for you, but it's much more difficult to figure out what's going on. And I think I therefore think that the kind of survey analysis that we're doing needs to be complemented with a case study approach, or an approach that also includes evidence from expert interviews, for example, to actually go into do interviews with stakeholders in unions, in employers associations, in governments, and then especially paying again attention to the question of whether there's a new political cleavage opening up in a way which goes right through these established institutions and maybe puts some institutions, unions, left parties more under pressure than maybe bourgeois conservative parties and employers associations. And the UBI, the Universal Basic Income, I think is a nice example of whether of the fact that this could actually be taking place, because I would say most of the debate about the UBI, whether it's good or not, is mostly taking place on the left side of the political spectrum, and there's a risk that people are still caught up in the process of figuring out how to respond, and that this kind of uncertainty actually hurts the prospects of promoting, if you want to put it like that, a progressive agenda on how to react to technological change. So I think this is from a policy perspective, a very relevant point to make. Maybe I can take on one or two observations on Stefanos and Dario's paper. I think this is really interesting, and especially the point that perceptions matter, I think is really crucial. I myself, of course, there's a long debate about it in literature, but I'm also skeptical of using these social class variables in addition to income and education. And then if you also have RTI in there, so much correlation, and then in the end you don't know anymore which explains which, and so I'm actually usually not using them at all. So it's leads to some discussions with reviewers and journals, but I think I think it's a little bit problematic, because if you just put it all in there, then all the effects are sort of gone, and then you don't really learn anything. But more of a question of understanding is that if I seen it right, then your number of observations drops quite a lot from around 700 to 350. And I mean, what's going on there? Maybe there's a problem there, because if you only have 350 observations in the sample, and it's not that surprising that the effects are not that strong. And then again, final comment, I think it's also not that surprising that the findings are not always strong. If you have 80-90% of agreement with a statement, there's not that much variation left to explain, right? Because if basically everybody agrees, there's not that much variation that these independent variables can pick off. I mean, this is not something that you cannot really do anything about that, but just the observation that obviously something is going on, because 80-90% of people want that kind of social compensation, and that might be related to the overall trend of technological change and globalization and increasing insecurities. It's of course something that you cannot really show with this survey-based approach directly if you don't have data from 10 years ago, and that's unfortunate, because as far as I know, this is the first time that the ESS includes this question, but it's still an important point, I think, especially if you think about the policy consequences.
Posso avere la presentazione? Okay, sorry. The point is that I wanted to show something. So this social class issue, yeah, I totally agree. And in particular, since actually the number drops simply because it's a split sample, and we ask the tech unemployment question to the split sample, okay? And there's another question on randomly drawn, and there's another question on globalization. Okay, out of 100 people who, do your same, perform your same occupation, who are in your same occupation, how many do you think will have lost, will lose their job in 10 years because of globalization? Okay, so we introduced this again in the round 9 of ESS, so we'll be able to see the differences. However, look at basic income. Even in the last column, when we introduce social classes, the interaction is highly significant. I mean, at the 1% level. So that was, that was kind of a, the ultimate or litmus test. And this kind of result is extraordinarily robust, insofar as even if you add social classes and that absorb a lot of variation, you still have that result. Okay, so we take it as a sign of something really strong there. And actually, I mean, the support is very high for GMI, which is, a problem insofar there is not so much variation. But between 55 and 60% for UBI. So at least, I mean, that result can be. And then that's also why I don't have the differences. I mean, those who are in support of one and not the other, and we use that. That clearly varies a lot more. Then Leah, interaction between the two perceptions of becoming unemployed. Yeah, that's we actually didn't interact them. We included it, and it's of course in the controls, and we ran a separate regression with dependent variable, the perception of tech risk, let's call it like this. And actually, of course, I mean, the two correlate, but the R squared is 0.1 or less. So actually, I mean, the two correlate, but it's not so strong. It doesn't explain so much of perception of tech unemployment, okay? Overall perception of your own being at risk. However, I mean, introducing an interaction term is a good idea. Problem is interactions, and we have 300 observations. So generally speaking, I will get to the other. I'm coming. Okay. The other question on by Furio on you know, the two channels and blah blah blah. But actually, I mean, do you refer to support for UBI or support for GMI, where the interaction term is negative, which is the problem? But then, I mean, the story of you are more exposed. You are also probably unionized, because these are the occupations, manufacturing and blah blah blah, and therefore you should be less in favor of that, and given let's say higher exposure, you are even less in favor. So I don't know how to, you know, I can't follow that route. Maybe, I mean, there is another causal path. High objective exposure. You are in manufacturing. You are an insider. You don't want you know, a means-tested benefit. What you want is a status-maintaining benefit. You want Kurzarbeit, you want short-time work, you want cassa integrazione. You don't want even to be, you know, to think that you can be unemployed and actually unemployed and get not even unemployment benefits, but a minimum income scheme. So that may be the causal path. Of course, I mean, it's highly, you know, conjectural, but comparative political economy literature tells us that it is very important to look at what kind of redistributive measure you know, you are in support of, because the causal paths are very different, and this is so we might include support for other measures in our analysis. This is something that we already discussed. And then lastly, I mean, and telegraphically, who is opposed to the redistribution? The rich? Well, actually, I mean, we know that precisely those who are less off, you know, less well off, who, you know, ideally should be supporting redistribution, actually, precisely because of that cultural dimension or whatever. So it is, again, this dimension of distributive deservingness. So you, in a sense, you want to mark, let's say, your, let's say, to mark the boundaries with other subsets of society. And so, I mean, that's why you privilege social insurance vis-a-vis social investment. That's why you don't want migrants to share. And maybe, I mean, only insofar as they work and they've been long-time residents, and so on and so forth. So in a situation of hardship, this is something that Karl Marx taught us. I mean, with proletariat and lumpen proletariat and exclusionary, I mean, strategies, precisely on the part of those who are less off.
Okay, so I was trying to organize my comments in 2 points because so much has been said. But so first, I'm not very surprised that Marius and I find somewhat different results, and also I'm actually replicating the analysis using the same approach for Germany, and we find the same economic results, but not the same political results. I'm not sure if this is because it's still ongoing research, but if it's because of the different electoral system or because of the different economic institutions. So, and like this discrepancy between the results depending on the empirical approach and the context, I think is well illustrated by, like there's a very, my favorite paper on this topic is by Dauth in Germany, and he shows in industries that will become more intense in robots in the future, that like many workers were organized in the 80s and 90s, and they bargain, like the unions bargain to keep their jobs in exchange for lower salary increases than in other industries. But then, and they kept their jobs, but there were fewer and fewer of those, and their sons like did not have access to these mid-paying jobs. No? So, and like this is a nice example in that, depending on whether you look at within individual change over time, at change in regions, at between individuals, or like it's not necessarily that mid-pay corresponds to mid-skills. Yeah, so we're depending on, like you have the same situation, but depending on how you try to study it, your conclusions will vary a lot, and I think it takes a bit of time to get like a sense of the picture. So that would be a first point. My second point, and it's related to Sean's like idea and other people that like maybe the losers are choosing the wrong policies, so they are not. And I think this also highlights the importance of doing both work on the objective labor market conditions and the subjective perceptions of workers, which need not be the case. But something more like probably important that's going on is that, like my intuition, so that we are seeing many changes, migration, trade, technological change, the European Union, and so on, and like they can produce some discomfort, but political entrepreneurs are strategic in the type of like how they frame and where they see more opportunities. So maybe it's more mobilizing to rant against the Chinese than to think about the complex labor market solutions that would involve adapting to the and so this like connection between objective and like it's a complex topic, and it's especially unlikely that there will be super close connections because it's not the topic is not super politicized. It's not that we are having an enlightened debate on like outside of some circles, no? So at least in the and I do think there's some value in trying to produce research that at least tries to structure ideas. And just as a final point, I love Marius's results on this, well, I can understand that the prospect of lifelong learning, it seems very exhausting, no? So when I need to learn Python and, you know, and now machine learning, and it never, like, yeah, it goes on and on and on. And like,
let's retire early.
Yeah, so I can understand that, like, this connection between your objective or the rational policies and what you want can at some point be different.
Okay, so I think that considering everything, we can say that we ran out of time. I don't know if there are exceptional and very urgent questions, but I think that we are already outside the bargain amount of time, and so I would like to sincerely thank all the panelists for the amazing contribution that they gave, all of you for attending, for those who are here, for those who survived since the early morning. Thank you again, and so see you tomorrow morning at 10:30 sharp, so 10:20 I guess. Yeah. And and tomorrow we envisage a very inspiring day, as today has been, and as you know, we will have Alan Manning, Enrique Fernandez Macias, Christian Bonlen, who is already here, Mario Pianta, Marco Vivarelli, Martina Bisello, Luca Marcolin, Giulio Perani, and many other speakers joining us in the afternoon. So please be with us and see you tomorrow. Thank you again for coming.